They had been taught that capture meant torture, that surrender meant shame worse than death. So when these 37 Japanese women were lined up by American soldiers in the Philippines in August 1945, they closed their eyes and waited for the end. But instead of gunfire, they smelled something they never expected. Coffee. Hot, American coffee. This is the story of how propaganda nearly killed 37 women, and how a cup of coffee shattered everything they believed about their enemy. Manila, Philippines. August 15th, 1945. The war had just ended, but Haruko Ito didn't know that yet. All she knew was that the sound of American boots was getting closer to the makeshift hospital bunker, where she and 36 other Japanese women had been hiding for 3 days. They had no food, no water, and no hope. Haruko was 28 years old, a trained nurse who had been stationed in the Philippines to care for wounded Japanese soldiers. For months, she had watched the tide of war turn against Japan. She had seen the burned bodies, the starvation, the desperation, and through it all, one message had been drilled into her mind by her superiors. Never surrender. The Americans will do unspeakable things to you. Death is better than capture. Now huddled in the darkness with the other women, Haruko repeated those words to herself. Death is better than capture. Death is honorable. Capture is eternal shame. Beside her, 19-year-old Michiko Yamamoto was trembling. The young communications assistant had seen propaganda posters throughout the war, images of brutal American soldiers committing atrocities. She had heard the stories from officers, tales designed to ensure that Japanese personnel would fight to the last breath rather than surrender. Michiko whispered to Haruko in the darkness, "Do you think it will be quick?" Her voice cracked with fear. Haruko didn't answer. She didn't know what to say. She had asked herself the same question 100 times in the past 3 days. On the other side of the bunker, Sachiko Tanaka sat with her back against the concrete wall. At 45, she was the oldest of the group, a former school teacher who had been recruited to work in Japanese administration offices in Manila. Sachiko had always prided herself on her logical mind, her ability to see through propaganda and think critically. But even she couldn't escape the fear that gripped her now. She had seen what war did to people, how it turned human beings into monsters. Why would the Americans be any different? The boots stopped outside the bunker entrance. Haruko heard voices in English, sharp commands she couldn't understand. Then the door burst open and sunlight flooded the space, blinding after 3 days of darkness. The women screamed. Some tried to run deeper into the bunker, but there was nowhere to go. Others simply froze, paralyzed by terror. Haruko forced herself to look at the soldiers who entered. They were tall, these Americans, with faces covered in dust and sweat. They carried rifles, and their expressions were hard, unreadable. This is it, Haruko thought. This is how I die. One of the soldiers, a sergeant with tired eyes, looked around at the women huddled in the bunker. He lowered his rifle and said something in English to the other soldiers. Then he raised his hands, palms out, in what Haruko recognized as a gesture of peace. But she didn't believe it. This was a trick. The propaganda had warned about this. The Americans would lull you into a false sense of security, and then the torture would begin. The sergeant stepped forward slowly, and Haruko saw the name on his uniform. Sullivan. Sergeant Robert Sullivan. He was speaking again, his voice calm, but Haruko couldn't understand the words. She pressed herself against the wall, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. Then something unexpected happened. A woman appeared behind the soldiers. She was wearing an American military uniform, but she was clearly a nurse. Captain Helen Bradford pushed past the soldiers and knelt down in front of the Japanese women, her eyes scanning them for injuries. Helen had been serving in the Pacific Theater for 2 years. She had seen the worst of war, the terrible things human beings did to each other. But she had also seen moments of profound humanity, small acts of kindness that reminded her why she had become a nurse in the first place. Looking at these terrified Japanese women, she saw not enemies, but patients who needed help. Helen spoke softly, trying phrases in broken Japanese she had learned from translated medical manuals. No hurt. Safe. Water. Food. The words were clumsy, her accent terrible, but the intention was clear. Michiko didn't believe it. She grabbed Haruko's arm and whispered frantically, "They're lying. This is what they do. They make you trust them, and then they kill you. My brother told me. He said the Americans are devils. We should fight. We should die fighting. Haruko looked at the young girl's terrified face and felt a wave of protective instinct. But what could she do? They had no weapons, no strength, no options. Fighting would just mean dying faster. Sergeant Sullivan could see the fear in the women's eyes. He had been fighting in the Pacific for 3 years, and he had seen what propaganda did to people on both sides. He had watched Japanese soldiers choose suicide over surrender, convinced that capture meant torture and dishonor. It sickened him. This waste of human life, all because of lies told by leaders who were safe far from the battlefield. Sullivan made a decision. He turned to one of his men and gave an order. 5 minutes later, a private returned carrying a field kettle and metal cups. The smell of coffee filled the bunker, rich and warm, and utterly unexpected. Sullivan poured coffee into several cups and set them on the ground in front of the women. Then he and the other soldiers stepped back, giving them space. Helen encouraged them with gestures, miming drinking, showing them it was safe. Haruko stared at the coffee. Steam rose from the dark liquid, carrying that distinctive smell. She had not eaten or drunk anything in 2 days. Her throat was raw with thirst. But this had to be a trap. Poison, perhaps. Or drugged. They would drink, and then they would be helpless. But Sachiko Tanaka was watching the American nurse, Helen Bradford, and something in the woman's eyes made her pause. Sachiko had spent 30 years teaching children, learning to read faces, to distinguish between truth and deception. And what she saw in this American woman's face was not cruelty or malice. It was compassion, exhaustion, and something else. Sadness. Why would she be sad? Sachiko wondered. Unless she understood what we are feeling. Unless she cared? Sachiko made a choice that would change everything. She reached forward, picked up one of the cups, and brought it to her lips. The other women gasped. Michiko tried to grab her arm, but Sachiko pulled away and drank. The coffee was hot and bitter and absolutely real. Sachiko felt the warmth spread through her body, felt her parched throat finally getting relief. She looked up at the Americans, confusion written across her face. If they wanted to kill us, why would they waste coffee on us first? Haruko watched Sachiko carefully. The older woman didn't collapse. She didn't show any signs of poisoning. She just sat there, holding the cup in her shaking hands, tears starting to roll down her face. One by one, the other women reached for the coffee. Haruko was one of the last. She picked up a cup and smelled it first, her medical training making her cautious. But it smelled like coffee. Just coffee. She drank, and the taste was unlike anything she had experienced in months. It tasted like something other than war. Sergeant Sullivan watched the women drink and felt a complex mixture of emotions. Relief that they were accepting help. Anger at the system that had taught them to fear kindness. Grief for all the people who hadn't gotten this chance, who had died believing their enemies were monsters. Helen Bradford moved among the women, checking for injuries and illnesses. She found malnutrition, dehydration, infected wounds and exhaustion, but nothing immediately life-threatening. As she worked, she tried to communicate with gestures and her broken Japanese. The women were still scared, but the initial terror was beginning to fade, replaced by confusion and cautious hope. Haruko watched Helen work and felt her worldview cracking. This American nurse was gentle and professional. She bandaged wounds carefully, gave water to those too weak to hold cups themselves, and spoke in soothing tones even though the women couldn't understand her words. This was not the behavior of a monster. This was the behavior of a fellow nurse. Over the next several hours, the women were transported to a temporary POW processing center. They were given medical examinations, food, clean water, and places to sleep. They were not tortured. They were not executed. They were treated as prisoners of war under international law. But the psychological impact of years of propaganda could not be erased in a few hours. That first night, Haruko lay awake on a clean cot in a guarded tent, unable to process what was happening. Everything she had been told about the Americans was proving to be false. They were not cruel. They were not inhuman. They were just soldiers, tired and dirty and ready for the war to be over, just like everyone else. Michiko was struggling even more. The young woman had built her entire understanding of the war around the belief that Japan was fighting against evil incarnate. If the Americans were not evil, then what did that make Japan? What did it make all the terrible things that had happened? The deaths, the suffering, the sacrifices. It was Sachiko who began to articulate what many of them were feeling. The older woman gathered a small group together the next day and spoke quietly in Japanese, knowing the guards couldn't understand. "We have been lied to. Our leaders told us these people were demons, but they are not. They are human beings. And if they lied to us about this, what else did they lie to us about?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implications. The women had grown up in a system that demanded absolute loyalty to the emperor, absolute faith in Japan's divine destiny. To question that system was to question everything they had ever known. Haruko found herself drawn to watching the American personnel at the camp. She watched Sergeant Sullivan as he organized supplies and dealt with the massive logistical challenge of processing thousands of Japanese prisoners. She watched Helen Bradford as she worked tirelessly in the medical tent, treating wounded Japanese soldiers and civilians with the same care she gave to Americans. One day, about a week after their capture, Haruko gathered her courage and approached Helen. Using hand gestures and the few words of English she had learned, she asked if she could help in the medical tent. Helen understood immediately and nodded, a smile breaking across her tired face. Working alongside Helen, Haruko experienced a strange sense of connection. Despite the language barrier, despite the fact that they had been enemies just weeks before, they understood each other in the way that medical professionals do. They worked efficiently together, anticipating each other's needs, focused on the shared goal of healing the sick and injured. During a brief break, Helen used a Japanese-English dictionary to laboriously communicate with Haruko. She asked about Haruko's training, about her experiences as a nurse. Haruko answered haltingly, finding words in the dictionary to express herself. They compared techniques, discussed treatments, and found that their medical knowledge was remarkably similar. Science, it seemed, transcended nationalism. One evening, Haruko found a quiet moment to really look at Helen. The American nurse was exhausted, dark circles under her eyes, her hands calloused from years of hard work. She had treated hundreds of Japanese prisoners with patience and professionalism, never showing anger or hatred, despite the fact that her brother had been killed by Japanese forces at Guadalcanal. Haruko had learned this from another prisoner who spoke some English. Helen had lost family to this war, and yet she still chose compassion. This realization shook Haruko to her core. She thought about the Japanese military doctors she had worked with, some of whom had participated in cruel experiments, who had justified atrocities as necessary for victory. She thought about the propaganda that had dehumanized the enemy, making it easier to commit terrible acts. And she thought about Helen Bradford, who had every reason to hate, and chose kindness instead. Michiko's transformation took longer. The young woman struggled with deep depression in the first weeks of captivity. Everything she had believed, everything she had been willing to die for, had turned out to be built on lies. She stopped eating, stopped speaking, retreated into herself. It was Sergeant Sullivan who finally reached her. He had been watching the young woman deteriorate and recognized the signs of profound psychological trauma. One day, he brought an interpreter and sat down near Michiko's cot. Through the interpreter, he told her his story. Sullivan spoke about growing up in a small town in Iowa, about his family, about his dreams of becoming a teacher before the war. He talked about the friends he had lost in combat, about the nightmares that woke him up at night, about the things he had seen and done that would haunt him forever. He talked about how he had been taught to hate the Japanese, to see them as subhuman enemies, but how actually meeting Japanese prisoners had forced him to confront his own prejudices. He told Michiko that she had been victimized by a system that used propaganda to control people, but that didn't mean her entire life was meaningless. She could choose how to move forward. She could choose to learn, to grow, to become something more than what the war had tried to make her. Michiko listened through her tears, and something in Sullivan's honest vulnerability gave her permission to begin healing. She started eating again. She started talking to the other women. She started to rebuild an identity that wasn't based on propaganda and lies. As the weeks passed, the women began to hear more news about the end of the war. They learned about the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They learned about the Emperor's surrender broadcast. They learned about the extent of Japan's defeat. For many, this news brought a complex mix of grief for their country and relief that the killing was finally over. They also began to hear stories from other prisoners about atrocities committed by Japanese forces, prisoners of war who had been tortured and starved. civilians who had been massacred, medical experiments conducted on living subjects. These stories were difficult to hear, and many prisoners initially refused to believe them. But as more evidence emerged, denial became impossible. Haruko felt a deep shame settling over her. She had served in a military that had committed terrible crimes. She had believed in a cause that had brought unspeakable suffering to millions. The Americans had shown her mercy that many Japanese prisoners had not shown to their captives. This knowledge was a burden that would stay with her for the rest of her life. But Sachiko offered a different perspective. The teacher gathered the women together and spoke with quiet conviction. We cannot change what has happened. We cannot undo the past. But we can choose how we move forward. We can choose to learn from this experience. We can choose to reject the hatred and propaganda that brought us here. We can choose to be better. In September 1945, arrangements were made to repatriate Japanese prisoners. The women would be sent back to Japan, to a country devastated by war, occupied by foreign forces and struggling to rebuild. Many of them were terrified of what they would find. Would their families be alive? Would they be rejected for having surrendered? Would they be able to build new lives in the ruins of the old world? On the day before departure, Haruko sought out Helen Bradford. Using the dictionary and the phrases she had learned over the weeks, Haruko tried to express her gratitude. Thank you. You show me truth. You show me humanity is bigger than war. Helen took Haruko's hands in her own and responded through an interpreter who had arrived to help with the repatriation process. You showed me the same thing. We are all just human beings trying to survive. I hope you find peace in your home, and I hope our countries never fight again. The two women embraced, tears streaming down both their faces. They knew they would likely never see each other again, but this brief connection had changed both of them forever. Sergeant Sullivan also came to say goodbye to the women he had helped rescue. He shook hands with many of them, offering words of encouragement through the interpreter. When he reached Michiko, he paused and looked at the young woman who had been so close to giving up entirely. You are stronger than you know. Build a good life. That is the best response to everything that tried to destroy you. Michiko bowed deeply, the traditional gesture of respect and gratitude. I will remember you. I will remember that enemies can become friends. I will teach this to my children someday. The journey back to Japan was long and emotionally overwhelming. The women traveled on American ships, still treated humanely, still fed and given medical care. As they approached the Japanese coastline, they could see the devastation from the air raids and naval bombardment. Cities reduced to rubble, harbors filled with sunken ships, a country brought to its knees. When they finally landed, they were processed by Allied occupation authorities and Japanese officials. There was confusion and bureaucratic chaos. Many families had been displaced by the war, and finding loved ones was a difficult and often heartbreaking process. Haruko eventually made her way back to her family's home in Tokyo, only to find it had been destroyed in the firebombing. She spent days searching refugee centers and makeshift camps before finally finding her mother and younger sister living in a shelter. The reunion was tearful and bittersweet. Her father and brother had both been killed in the war. As she held her mother and sister, Haruko told them about her time as a prisoner. She told them about the coffee, about Helen Bradford, about learning that the propaganda had been lies. Her mother listened with a mixture of shock and sadness. We all believed the propaganda. We all thought surrender meant death. How many people died because of those lies? In the months and years that followed, the women from that bunker in Manila rebuilt their lives in occupied Japan. Some struggled with trauma and shame. Others found ways to channel their experiences into positive change. Many of them became advocates for peace, speaking quietly in their communities about what they had learned about propaganda and dehumanization. Haruko returned to nursing, working in hospitals that were desperately short-staffed in the post-war period. She brought with her the lessons she had learned from Helen Bradford, treating all patients with compassion regardless of their background. She never forgot the moment when she expected death and received coffee instead, the moment when her worldview shattered and rebuilt itself into something more human. Michiko eventually became a teacher like Sachiko had been. She dedicated herself to educating young people about the dangers of propaganda and blind nationalism. She taught her students to question authority, to think critically, to see the humanity in all people. She never spoke publicly about her time as a prisoner, but she carried those lessons with her every day. Sachiko wrote a memoir in her later years, documenting her experiences and reflecting on how easily entire populations could be manipulated into believing terrible lies. Her book was controversial in post-war Japan, where many people were still reluctant to confront the reality of what their country had done during the war. But it found an audience among younger generations who wanted to understand how such a catastrophe had been possible. The story of those 37 Japanese women closing their eyes and expecting execution, only to be given coffee instead, became a small footnote in the massive history of World War II. It was not a story of grand strategy or decisive battles. It was a story of individual human beings choosing compassion in the midst of hatred, choosing truth over propaganda, choosing to see the humanity in their enemies. Years later, in the 1960s, Haruko had the opportunity to visit the United States as part of a medical exchange program. While she was in California, she tried to find information about Helen Bradford, hoping to reconnect with the woman who had shown her such kindness. Through various veterans organizations and medical associations, she finally tracked down an address. Helen was retired, living in a small town in Oregon. When Haruko's letter arrived, Helen wept as she read it. She had thought about those Japanese women prisoners many times over the years, wondering what had become of them, hoping they had found peace. The two women began a correspondence that would last for the rest of their lives. They wrote about their families, their work, their hopes for the future. They wrote about the war, slowly processing the trauma they had both experienced. They wrote about peace, about reconciliation, about the possibility of a world where such conflicts would no longer happen. In one letter, Haruko wrote, "That coffee you gave us saved our lives not just physically, but spiritually. You showed us that our enemies were human beings, and in doing so, you gave us back our own humanity. We had been taught to see ourselves as weapons, as tools of the Emperor's will. You reminded us that we were people." Helen responded, "I was just doing what any decent person should do, but I am grateful that it meant so much to you. The war taught me that we are all capable of terrible things, but also capable of extraordinary kindness. We get to choose which impulse we follow." The correspondence between Haruko and Helen became a symbol of post-war reconciliation between Japan and America. In the 1970s, when both women were elderly, they were invited to speak at a peace conference in San Francisco. They stood on stage together, two old women who had once been enemies, and told their story to an audience of young people who had no memory of the war. Haruko spoke about the power of propaganda to poison minds and hearts. She spoke about how easily fear can turn into hatred, how quickly dehumanization can justify atrocities. And she spoke about how a simple act of kindness, a cup of coffee offered when execution was expected, had the power to break through years of indoctrination. Helen spoke about the importance of seeing the individual human being, even in the midst of war. She spoke about her brother who had died fighting against Japan and how she had struggled with anger and grief. She spoke about the choice she had made to treat those Japanese women prisoners as patients first, as human beings who needed help, rather than as enemies to be punished. Together, they delivered a powerful message about reconciliation, about the possibility of healing even the deepest wounds, about the human capacity for both cruelty and compassion. The audience, many of them young activists working for peace during the Vietnam War era, gave them a standing ovation that lasted several minutes. After the conference, Haruko and Helen spent a week together, making up for decades of only written communication. They visited museums and memorials dedicated to the war. They talked about their families, their losses, their regrets. They laughed about the absurdity of language barriers and cultural misunderstandings. They cried about the friends and loved ones who hadn't survived. On their last day together, they visited a Japanese garden in Golden Gate Park. Sitting on a bench surrounded by carefully cultivated beauty, Haruko turned to Helen and said, "I wish we had met under different circumstances. I wish we could have been friends without a war forcing us together." Helen took her hand and replied, "But we did meet, and we are friends. Maybe that is the one good thing that can come from terrible events. Maybe the connections we forge in darkness are even more precious because of how they began." Haruko nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I close my eyes sometimes and I'm back in that bunker waiting to die. And then I smell coffee and I remember that I survived. We survived. And we made something beautiful out of something terrible." The two women sat in silence for a long time, holding hands. Two survivors of a war that had tried to teach them to hate each other, but had instead brought them together in unexpected friendship. Haruko Ito passed away in 1988 at the age of 71. In her final years, she had become a respected voice for peace and reconciliation in Japan. Her family found among her possessions a small collection of letters from Helen Bradford, tied with a ribbon, and a photograph of the two of them taken at that peace conference in San Francisco. On the back of the photograph, in Haruko's handwriting, were the words, "The day I expected death, I received coffee and life. Never forget the power of unexpected kindness." Helen Bradford lived until 1995, reaching the age of 82. She spent her retirement volunteering with refugee organizations, helping people displaced by wars around the world. She often told the story of the Japanese women prisoners and the coffee, using it to illustrate her belief that individual acts of compassion can ripple outward in ways we can never fully predict. The other women from that bunker in Manila also lived full lives, carrying with them the lessons of that transformative moment. Some spoke publicly about their experiences, while others preferred to keep their stories private, but all of them remembered the smell of coffee, the feeling of terror giving way to confusion and then hope, the realization that everything they had been taught about their enemies was a lie. Michiko Yamamoto became a prominent educator and anti-war activist. She wrote extensively about the psychology of propaganda and how to teach critical thinking to young people. She never forgot Sergeant Sullivan's words about choosing how to move forward, and she dedicated her life to helping others make that choice toward peace and understanding. Sachiko Tanaka's memoir became required reading in many Japanese universities in the decades after the war. Her unflinching examination of how propaganda had shaped her beliefs and actions inspired a generation of scholars and activists. She lived to see Japan transform from a militaristic empire to a pacifist democracy, and she took some satisfaction in knowing that her words had contributed to that transformation. The story of these 37 women is a reminder that war is not just about armies and weapons and strategies. It is about individual human beings caught in circumstances beyond their control, forced to make impossible choices, struggling to maintain their humanity in the face of dehumanizing ideologies. It is a reminder that propaganda works by making us forget that our enemies are human beings just like us, with families and dreams and fears. It works by creating false narratives that justify cruelty and violence. It works by making us believe that there is no alternative to hatred. But it is also a reminder that propaganda can be broken, that even the most deeply ingrained beliefs can be shattered by direct human contact, by acts of unexpected kindness, by the simple realization that we have more in common than we have differences. The women who closed their eyes expecting execution and instead smelled American coffee had their worldviews transformed in that moment. They were forced to confront the reality that they had been lied to, that their enemies were not monsters, that surrender did not mean the horrors they had been promised. That transformation was difficult and painful, but it also opened up possibilities for growth and healing that would have been impossible if their expectations had been met. Today, in an era of increasing polarization and dehumanizing rhetoric, the story of Haruko Ito and Helen Bradford feels more relevant than ever. We are constantly bombarded with messages designed to make us fear and hate those who are different from us. We are told that compromise is weakness, that our opponents are evil, that violence is the only solution. But the story of those Japanese women prisoners reminds us that there is always another choice, that we can choose to see the humanity in others, even when we have been taught to see them as enemies, that we can choose compassion over cruelty, understanding over hatred, connection over division. The smell of coffee in that bunker in Manila was more than just a sensory experience. It was a symbol of unexpected mercy, of the possibility of human connection even in the darkest circumstances, of the power of small acts of kindness to change lives and alter the course of history. When we close our eyes in fear, convinced that the worst is about to happen, sometimes we are surprised by coffee instead of execution. Sometimes we are given the opportunity to transform our understanding, to grow beyond our prejudices, to become more fully human. The question is whether we will take that opportunity or whether we will cling to the comfortable certainties of our propaganda-fed fears. The women who survived that bunker in Manila chose transformation. They chose to face the difficult truth that they had been deceived, to rebuild their understanding of the world, to dedicate their lives to ensuring that future generations would not be so easily manipulated. Their choice was not easy, but it was ultimately redemptive. Their story is a gift to us, a reminder that change is always possible, that healing can happen even after terrible trauma, that enemies can become friends, and that the simple act of offering coffee to someone who expects death can echo through decades, inspiring countless others to choose compassion over cruelty, truth over lies, and humanity over ideology. If you found this story meaningful, please subscribe to our channel for more untold stories from history that remind us of our shared humanity. Leave a comment below sharing your thoughts on this remarkable encounter, and hit the like button to help others discover these important lessons from the past. Together, we can learn from history and build a more compassionate future.